Hello guys and welcome. For this video I'm going to talk about the PC-FX by NEC, but more specifically about the technical specs and what it is actually capable of. Because you see a lot of people, they mention numbers they throw around, but they don't get the full picture of what it is actually capable of, what it can do. And you'll get the idea, but in short, it's not as powerful as people might think it is. And the games that were released on the platform actually reflect what the console is capable of. So let's get started. But before we get into that, a brief overview of the hardware itself. So it supports composite and S-video out of the box. I do have to say that S-video looks pretty good on this. To the point that looks almost like RGB. That's mostly because the hardware actually internally works with YUV colors. So yeah, it's not actually RGB, but you can technically modify it to have like the hardware output component video, but obviously that's not going to work out of the box. Now it comes with an internal power supply. You can see the note that it says it consumes like 16 watts, but when I tested the actual thing, it actually consumed way beyond that. It was like 20 watts. So it doesn't look like it, but this is a beefy monster. Like for comparison, the PS1 consumes like 9 watts at best. That's similar for the Saturn. It's like 10, 11 watts. And of course, the Sega Dreamcast, the stock one, it's like 25 watts, 15 watts with a GDMU. So yeah, a Dreamcast with a GDMU consumes less than a PC-FX. So keep that in mind. There's also a power terminal, power output terminal. That's those with RF. Obviously, you don't need that. In fact, most people are not going to need that. On the front of the unit, there's like the FX BMP slot, which is like behind like some kind of latch. And on the rear, there's an expansion slot. One of the accessories basically turns the PC-FX into an external CD drive. I do not recommend the use of this accessory though, because the CD drive is notorious for being fragile on the PC-FX. So yeah, I would stay away from that. Now let's actually talk about the specs, but a brief overview. So the CPU, it's actually a CPU made by NEC. So this is the V810, which is clocked at 21 megahertz, 32 bits. Doesn't have like a 16 bus like the variant does on the Virtual Boy, as far as I know anyway. And when I tested my code, it was fully 32 bits. But there are other bits restrictions and bus that I'll talk about shortly. RAM, it is indeed a full 2 megabytes, so just like the PS1 and the 3DO, that's very nice. On the Saturn, there is 2 megabytes. However, one portion is fast memory, the other is slow RAM. So it's actually one megabytes. And it's actually very annoying to work with. So I'm really glad that it is just a flat 2 megabytes. Video RAM, now I see this number of 1 megabytes. I cannot find much evidence of that. It could be that it is a misunderstanding though, that they took a look at like all of these stuff like or Rainbow, my bad, and the VDC chips and the King, and they added it up and it was like 1 megabyte. But yeah, no. So the real numbers are 256 kilobytes of KRAM. So the KRAM is used for the King chip and also ADPCM as well. And the two VDC chips, which I'll talk about later, those have their own 128 kilobytes each, which totals half of a megabyte of video memory at best. It can be smaller than that for most games. The CD drive is 2x. It is decently fast for what it is, but it is quite fragile. I've had like PS1s that can be easily fixed with a bit of tuning. The PC-FX would most likely require you to actually tune the laser, otherwise it's not going to work. Fortunately, when you do that, you actually decrease the lifespan, but it's better than just not using the damn thing. Now the PC-FX, it's a bit particular because in addition to the previous PC Engine VDCs, well, to be more specific, it's actually derived from the Super Graphics, except it has more memory dedicated to each. On the Super Graphics, there was like 64 kilobytes each of video memory to each VDCs. It's double that amount on the PC-FX. But on the PC-FX, there's an additional chip, which is called the King chip, or HUC 6272. And this can do bitmap modes. However, you can also do the so-called block mode, which are essentially tiled modes. You would mostly want to use block mode if your game is 2D and you prefer to work with tiles. And prefer, it depends on what kind of games you want to make. If you want to do like some kind of a 3D game, and I'll show you an example later in this video, then you want to use the bitmap modes. However, you can use the bitmap mode on the King chip and then use the VDC chips for like the block mode stuff. So you can have like a tile-based game that uses like VDCs along with sprites, of course, but still kind of supplement that with the King chip. And some games do that, although not all of them. For games didn't want to look like PC Engine games. The King chip can do more. And there's a motion JPEG decoder, that's the so-called rainbow chip. And it's a bit odd, and it's not fully understood how it works, but I think I have an idea why. And there's 2 ADPCM chip channels, as part of the King chip, and also 6 PSG channels, which are again taken from the PC Engine, and then they just stuffed it in the PC-FX. And it's actually used by quite a few games, including Battle Heat. Battle Heat uses a PSG channels, mostly because they have to stream audio and video from the CD-ROM drive. And during all of that, it can't stream music. So it has to do music on the PSG channels. So let's talk about the CPU, the V810. It has a built-in FPU, so it can do floating points. And it's your standard IEEE 754. There are some limitations, so some stuff is still going to be software emulated. But essentially, this is, I believe, one of the earliest console with a floating point unit, if I'm not mistaken. So it's pretty nice, actually. Not even the PS1 had a floating point unit. Not even the Saturn or the 32X. I believe the Nintendo 64 had one, but it came out like 2 years later. The Pippin, I believe, also has an FPU. But yeah, those came out later. So the PC-FX, along with the Virtual Boy, were the only consoles with like a built-in FPU, which is nice. But it's not really used by games because it's actually quite slow. So it's not a good idea to use the FPU on this thing. It's pretty weak, and it has lots of limitations, as I mentioned. Now, the nice thing, however, is the 1 kilobytes of instruction cache. Now, the instruction cache for the PC-FX, as far as I tested anyway, it's mostly useful if you have, say, a loop, or more specifically an unrolled loop of multiple instructions. So say you want to do like, you want to copy like 16 bytes at a time in the loop, and then you loop that. the instruction cache is helpful for that because it helps speeds up that process. Without the instruction cache, you lose quite a bit of performance. In my test with like a 3D cube, I lost like 10 FPS. So we went from like 35 FPS down to 25 FPS. So yeah, it is essential that you make great use of the instruction cache. However, it seems that most games, except for one, that had like some ray casting engine for like the RPG portions, did not really care about the instruction cache because the games are so simple that the CPU is actually quite capable, although it's not the fastest 32-bit CPU even before the generation it was released in. But it's really the rest of the hardware that boggles it down. So no MMU, but that's to be expected. The Dreamcast, I believe, along with the Pippin, were the first consoles with an MMU. I think the N64 also had an MMU, but I could be wrong on that. I'm not sure if they actually stripped the MMU on that. It is RISC based, from what I saw. I didn't do much assembly, but it was apparently inspired by MIPS and i960, which I haven't done a lot of work with. MIPS, I did do a bit of MIPS 32, not directly, but on MIPS 32 platforms. And of course, the PS1 is also using a MIPS-based CPU. So in that sense, they are kind of similar, but not really. And the interesting thing is that because of the CPU, which is quite capable, most PCFX games are actually programmed in C. Now, this isn't the first video game platform where, developers were using like a C SDK for developing games. Sonic Spinball, for instance, was programmed in C by Sega, which explains the various slowdowns. But yeah, the PCFX, along with the PS1, they shipped on release, as far as I gather anyway, with an SDK and a C compiler. And if you have like the PC-FXGA SDK, it is the same as C compiler, and also you get a bunch of tools to work on it. As far as I gather anyway, I didn't hear a ton of complaints about the SDK itself, rather the hardware itself, which is inadequate, as you're about to see. So let's talk about the King chip. So on the surface, it seems quite capable, but you realize that it is essentially a 2D chip. There's nothing 3D on that chip. There's no instructions there's no coprocessor that is inside of the King chip. All the King chip does is essentially you can initialize a bitmap mode or block mode from 4 colors up to 60 million colors. It works on YUV, a color space, interestingly enough. And I believe that's because Hudson was trying to make this an anime console, so to speak. And so they focused a lot of attention on not just the image quality, but on video and stuff like that. Unfortunately for them, the PS1 has something called the MDEC chip. And even though it's not as capable as what the PCFX can do, it was decent enough. But anyway, on the King chip, most of the color resolutions that you're going to use are either 16 colors if you do some flat shaded polygons. No retail games actually did that though, but from my experience, you want to use that color mode for performance. 256 colors, which was used by a few games, and you can do 60 million colors, which was used instead by visual novels. There is also a high color mode, but although it works, I don't really see the point of it. And if you use it, there's a huge performance penalty. And if you want to do pre-processed stuff, you might as well use like the 60 million color modes, which oddly enough requires the same amount of space as the high color mode. It's a bit weird how it is done in memory, but yeah, it has a lot to do with the fact that it uses YUV and stuff like that. Anyway, but as I mentioned, yeah, it is YUV, but it's on 16 bits. So there are 8 bits that are reserved for Y, and then 4 bits for U and V. So essentially, it's like 8 bits Y and then 8 bits for UV. It doesn't look bad, but it's kind of not appropriate for gaming, especially if you want to do like 3D stuff. Fortunately, it's not a huge issue. It's just something that you would not expect. And yeah, most consoles I dealt with, they work in the RGB color space. This is one of the few ones, along with like maybe the NES, that doesn't work in RGB. The NES was a bit odd. The colors could differ a bit depending on what TV you were using. This one though, unfortunately, doesn't have this quirk. But yeah, there is also a rotate function, but it only works for 256 colors or lower. It was used by one game for like the boss section, and it was basically to rotate and then decrease, scale it down, and that was basically the only use for it in retail games. As far as I gather, yeah, I think the color restrictions are probably why, because the way it works is there's a micro program that you put inside of the kingship, and depending on the micro program, you can either do stuff like, okay, you can only do 16 colors, but you're allowed to have multiple backgrounds, and you can layer each of them. So yes, technically the PC-FX can have like 8 backgrounds, but that's only true if each backgrounds are only 4 colors each. If you increase the color counts, and as far as I can gather anyway, you cannot mix them, or at least not easily, then you lose background layers. For the 60 million colors mode, you only allowed 1 background layer because there's not enough space for the micro program, and also not enough memory anyway, because the KRAM, although it is 256 kilobytes, it's actually divided into 2 pages of 128 kilobytes each, so 2 pages of KRAM. And 16 million colors mode uses the entire space allocated for just 1 KRAM. There's also another restriction, the fact that for any video modes, you're only allowed to use 1 KRAM page. And also, this applies to ADPCM and even the Rainbow chip. They are only allowed to select 1 KRAM page. And given the fact that there's not a ton of space to begin with, you can see where the restrictions are. It's pretty bad. Like, you have a next gen console, and you only reserve, like, at best 256 kilobytes of VRAM for the whole kingship, and that VRAM is also used to store your ADPCM samples. Like, just to give you an idea, even the 3DO was better than this. So the 3DO had like 2 megabytes, 1 megabyte of video RAM, and then 32 kilobytes of sound. Now you might say, well, that's not a lot better. It's in fact possibly worse. But on the 3DO you can stream the sound from RAM. You cannot easily do that on the PC-FX. And I forgot to mention as well, the palette modes, for whatever reason, they are essentially big engine, even though the CPU is little engine. So that makes them even more awkward to work with. And in some cases, that can incur a huge performance penalty for if you're trying pixels. It makes it kind of annoying to work with, especially if you're trying to get the best performance out of it, which this thing doesn't make it easy. And also, there is no DMA support. So if you have, say, a block of, say, a frame buffer, an internal frame buffer, where you software render graphics on that, and you say, okay, I want to use DMA to push that to KRAM. You cannot do that. You can ironically do that from the CD subsystem, which is used for like the video and stuff, but you cannot do that from RAM. And what? It's very clear from the way that they designed the system that they did not want people to make 3D games on this. So essentially, if you want to do a 3D game on it, it works like this. So you have an internal frame buffer that is stored in RAM, and you work on that. Okay, cool. But then you want to actually show it on screen. You want your frame buffer to be shown to people, to be on video. So how do you do that? Well, there are a bunch of I/O stuff on the King chip that you use. So basically, it's basically an out function that you do at a certain King address. I believe it is like a 64 or hexadecimal or something like that. And then you push bytes to that. Or more specifically, you push 16 bits at a time to the King chip. And as you can guess, it's very slow. You have to do it on each 16 bits. You cannot go any faster than that. And also, you must set the address inside of the KRAM to tell it where you want to draw. Now, this is a big deal, but I mean, you know, you have to do that, and then you can only push 16 bits at a time. And you have no DMA. So yeah, in spite of that, you can still achieve 3D graphics, even flat shaded polygons. The issue is that as you increase the color count, you have to push more bytes to the King chip. And as the number of bytes that you have to transfer increases, your bandwidth is essentially lower, because guess what? 60 million colors is 4 BPP. 256 colors is 8 BPP. So essentially, when you go from 8 BPP to 4 BPP, your throughput is doubled because of this stupid decision about the King chip. But anyway, there's no graphic source to the PC-FX. In fact, they only added a 3D chip when they released like a PC variant, which I'll talk about later in this video. And you know, as I mentioned, it does support ADPCM decoding. So the way it works is you put your ADPCM sample somewhere in KRAM. You tell the hardware where the ADPCM samples are stored, and that can be shared with like the active KRAM for like video and stuff. Of course, that depends if you have enough space for that. And it can do 4 bits up to 32 kilohertz and stereo channels. Now I've tested this myself. It does work. You can do stereo, but obviously stereo, it's more bytes, and you only have like 128 kilobytes to work with for sound at best. Okay, and guess how you need to transfer those samples to KRAM? Well, you do have the option of using this SCSI DMA to transfer it directly to KRAM. That would work. But what if you have to store it in RAM and then push it to like KRAM? You have to go through the slow King interface 16 bits at a time. Yeah. There are sequential and rain modes, but in my games I only use sequential, and even then I was not able to get it 100% right. It seems that for sequential, it goes on forever, like it never stops. I mean, even though the hardware supposedly says that it stops. And games, retail games, apparently use like a buggy ADPCM encoder, which meant nothing has a toggle to enable or disable. But yeah, that's the gist of the King chip. It, even though it seems like a big chip, it doesn't do a whole lot. So it's a bit, it can be deceiving. Now let's talk about the VDC. Now originally, NEC was planning to ship the PCFX with a 3D chip, which is the Aurora chip that we'll talk about later. However, for like the PCFX release for like Christmas, the 3D chip was just not ready. It needed several months before it can even work. So what they did instead, they added two VDC chips from the Super Graphics and then just stuffed in there. I mean, if you see like the photo, that's literally what it is. And it is essentially the same VDC as the one in the Super Graphics, except it has like 128 kilobytes each. That means that if you combine the two VDC chips, you can have sprites with up to 256 colors each. However, if you do that, your sprite count is also decreased. So yeah, so 16 sprites on one scan line with one VDC chip, or 32 if you use both, unless you use the 256 color modes. And you know, there's not much to say about it. It works like the video chip in the PC Engine. Now, ironically, the PC Engine, it was an 8-bit CPU, but the VDC chip was 16 bits, so you have to transfer 16 bits at once. While on the PC Engine, you had to do it for like 2 8 bits. However, the situation is the opposite on the PC-FX. The CPU is 32 bits, but the VDC chips are still 16 bits, just like the King chip actually. So, so yeah, kind of ironic, but the PC-FX is the best way to get the best performance out of the VDC chips, which, you know, if you have, have to use them if you have to make a PC-FX game, even for simple stuff like a cursor sprite on the screen, and then you use a King chip for everything else. But you can also do stuff like, say, you can use sprites to display the character on screen and then kind of fake the scaling. Because say you use a King chip to generate the environment, but now you have nothing else to for the sprites, or at least the 256 colors mode for like the rotate and stuff. It's not really adequate for that. You cannot control each portion of the screen and tell it to scale it down or whatever. It's just all or nothing. So you can kind of fake sprite scaling with that. Although I believe you can have multiple 16 colors mode and then apply a rotate and scaling to each of those. So that's something I need to look into. But I believe if you program like the micro program correctly, you can do that also. So that's something to look into. Let's talk about the Rainbow chip, which is a lot of games PC-FX. I'm not sure if there's even one PC-FX game besides my own, of course, that doesn't use the Rainbow chip. What this does is it simply decodes MJPEG. And then once it has decoded MJPEG, it pushes that to a KRAM page. And that's at least as far as that's my impression of it. Because when you initialize everything, you have to tell the Rainbow chip which KRAM page it must use. And that essentially tells me that it actually simply acts as a decoder for motion JPEG, and it is quite a big chip for what it does. It's kind of like a MJPEG to, well, not, it's MPEG to decoder chips that you would see on like PCI cards. Except, of course, this is for MJPEG, which is a lot simpler. Of course, if you don't like the quality of it for whatever reason, you can implement your own software playback. There was Cinepack, which was used on the Saturn. There are also others. There are stuff like LZ77 variants. And I suppose you can stream in compressed 4BPP graphics and then just compress them that way. That's an option. But yeah, as far as I got, this is all it does. And I don't know how the image is actually encoded or decoded for like a rainbow chip. That's something to look into. I guess in theory, I could just grab the memory content from, a PCFX game and just display it on that. But yeah. Now there's the sound chip, but it's actually just the same sound chip as the PC engine. Well, to be more clear, it's actually the hardware revision that was found in the Super Graphics. The difference is that on the PC-FX, you have a more precise timer. So on the PC-FX, if you were to try to use the timer, you were limited by the kilohertz range. I think it was like 8,000 hertz that you could do with the timer, and then a bit more if you use like something that is scanline based. On the PC-FX, you can just tweak the timer and have it go like a lot higher. You can do stuff like 25 kilohertz without any major tweaks or whatever. In the case of my game, I just set it to 16 kilohertz, and that works fine for that purpose. It sounds the same as it did on the PC-FX otherwise. As I mentioned earlier, it's usually used when CDDA cannot be used or any custom audio format cannot be used for essentially music. Because I have to mention, there is no actual PCM playback on the PC-FX, which is just mind-blowing. There's only PSG and ADPCM. If you absolutely need PCM playback, you need to kind of fake it on the PSG. You essentially have to shove it down the PSG chips for that. And yeah, it can also be used in junction with the ADPCM chips. So in theory, you can, if you do like the speech trick on the PSG chips with like the hardware timer, you can have essentially 8 sample-based channels. Granted, it's still a lot worse than what you can do on the PS1 or even the Sega Saturn for that matter. But it's kind of better than the PC Engine. Actually, it's not that better than the PC Engine, because on the PC Engine CD, you also had an DPCM decoder. Sure, it was one channel, and sure, it was only limited at 11 kilohertz, but it was essentially the same. And you can see where the problem is with the PC-FX. So far, it's not a huge upgrade over the PC Engine CD. It was kind of disappointing. Now, they did release the PC-FXGA. This was essentially a PC-FX that was self-contained on a CBus or ISA card. So ISA for the MS-DOS version, and CBus for the PC-98 version. And that supports S-Video. So if you play a PC-FXGA game, you need to use S-Video on that. You cannot use your PC's own VGA output for that. It requires also external power because, as I showed you, or well, as I told you, it consumes like 20 watts on its own. So I'm guessing that's why they added like an external jack for that. And as you can see, it is like 13 volts also. So yeah, it's beefy. And this one though, it has the so-called Aurora chip, which is the 3D chip. So when this thing was released, the 3D chip was finally ready, and they added it to the PC chip. NEC had plans to make an external card for the PCFX that would add Aurora to the system. Apparently, Capcom said they were interested in making games for it if NEC would release it. However, NEC never did. Instead, they just pushed this PC card, probably to gauge interest, and then it never went beyond that. It was a lost cause, from what I gather. In fact, when the PCFX was released, they completely ruled out a Western release. And in the hardware itself, I couldn't find any evidence of a power mode support. Now, to be fair, the PC Engine never properly supported PAL either, but yeah. For comparison, the Casio Loopy, it supports PAL in the video hardware, even though it was only released in Japan. So that tells you something. So about the Aurora chip, so it can do, well, it is said to be capable of 100,000 polygons per second. Now, keep in mind that's per second. So if you divide that by 60, you get the so-called real amount of polygons that you can generate per frame. So in that case, it's a lot lower if you do the math. It's actually, yeah, it's just over 1,000 polygons per frame, which is typically also the amount of polygons that you can do on the Sega Saturn and PS1. Typically, I would bet though that, I mean, we never saw true usage of the Aurora chip in games, because the only two games that were shipped with this, they were quite unimpressive, to be honest. It can do texture mapping. It is fixed point based, so kind of like the PS1 actually. The odd thing is that the 3D demos that were shipped with like the PCFXGA, so oddly enough, they were using like floating points, and then they were converting that on the fly to fixed points before finally pushing that to the 3D chip. The functions that they had for the 3D chip, they were all integer based. And to see that in a demo by NEC was just mind-blowing. I'm pretty sure the intent was to show people how it works, kind of like a beginner's tutorial. But from a performance point of view, you're not supposed to do that. In fact, they were the demos that I saw even use multiply and divisions, and I know from experience that those are really bad from a performance point of view for the PCFX, because even though the final step is up to the GPU's job, you still have to do a lot of transform and stuff on the CPU. So you're essentially wasting CPU cycles if you do it improperly. And it actually accepts triangle list, at least as far as the functions that expose the GPU did. And it also was able to read pixels from textures. Now, that is not something that's true for some hardware, because there are usually restrictions on that. But, or if it can, there's a huge performance penalty if you try to read from textures, because VRAM is usually slower than RAM. And I would suspect you still have this latency, but actually maybe not, because I don't think this thing uses KRAM. I think it uses RAM for holding the stuff. or maybe it has its own dedicated memory. It's not actually made clear what portion of memory it uses. I have to take a deeper look at the examples, but yeah, it's not. If I believe that's where the 1 megabytes of VRAM number comes from. The fact that the missing kilobytes of RAM were actually allocated to this Aurora chip, hence the confusion. But it can also display and rotate images. There are actually opcodes for that in the Aurora chip. At least that's what the documentation implies. And the demos definitely make use of this. There are plenty of demos that show how to apply rotations and stuff. And it goes without saying that those demos are not going to work on the PC-FX. I should point that out. Now, I'm going to show you something really cool. So I did a 3D Cube demo that well, first of all, I had like a prototype on PC, and then I ported it to the PC-FX, and I captured it on real hardware to gauge the real performance. Then I also did the same, but for the Casio Loopy, and then so here are the results. So side by side, PC-FX on the left, Casio Loopy on the right. And even though I don't have a frame rate counter for the Casio Loopy, and I mean, you can tell it is a lot faster. In fact, it would have been a lot faster if it weren't for like compiler bugs. But on the PC-FX, due to the aforementioned restrictions on the King chip, it's a lot slower. It's actually twice as slow. Now, granted, I could make this twice as fast, in theory, if I were to use 4BPP. That's because in 4BPP mode, clearing the frame buffer, you have to clear less bytes. But when you push stuff to the hub chip, you also don't need to push as many bytes as possible. And yeah, it's kind of like a domino effect. The less work you do, the better. On the Casio Loopy, the well, it's actually the VDP chip. So kind of look like the Genesis, but not really. And it can do bitmap modes at the aforementioned resolution. Actually, 256 by 240 or 224 for like the vertical resolution. It's a lot faster. So the VDP chip, even though it works on 16 bits like the PC-FX, it, at least from what I can see in emulators, it's quite a lot faster at this task. And you can see quite a few games actually doing frame buffer effects on the Casio Loopy. That would be a lot slower to do on the PC-FX. And there's also DMA support on the Casio Loopy, something there is not on the PC-FX. I was not using DMA for this example though, but even manually pushing bytes, I could tell it was way faster than doing so on the PC-FX. This King chip is just way too slow for that. So yeah, that's really all there is to it for like the PC-FX. Unfortunately, I was disappointed in the hardware itself. And Alex Marshall publicly said he stopped working on the PC-FX for homebrew stuff because he was so disappointed with the PC-FX hardware. It's just so underwhelming. It is a turbocharged PC engine. There's just no other way to look at it. It is such a minor revision in comparison to the PS1 or the Sega Saturn, or even the 3DO for that matter. And I dare to say even the Atari Jaguar is better than the PC-FX in some aspect. Although the PC-FX is definitely better to program for than the Atari Jaguar. It's just that unlike the Jaguar, the chips that you are given and the core processors, they are the opposite. They are completely useless. So thank you for watching and bye.